be the singer. It's August 1979, and I've just bought my first electric guitar. It's a black Les Paul copy, which I bought for 60 quid from a bloke in London Fields via a small ad in the back of Melody Maker. I'm amazed at myself. Where have I found the audacity to buy this, well, very masculine icon? And it does feel masculine. That's one of the things I like about it. It's heavy for a start. I hadn't realised it would be. I get a strap with it in the case, and I hang it round my neck, and almost immediately it makes my shoulder ache. I love the feel, the weight of it. I get it home, take it out and fondle it, then try to play it a little. And here's the thing, I don't have an amp, or even a lead, and if I'm going to be really honest, I'm not certain I even realised you needed one. I've never paid any attention to what happened behind and around guitar players in bands, and so I think I imagined that the point of an electric guitar was that you plugged it into the electricity socket in the wall and somehow a loud noise came out. I still have a lot to learn. I sit in my bedroom and quietly play my unplugged electric guitar, and it is of course even quieter than an acoustic guitar would be. I practice like this for a while and get into the habit of making very little noise. This is good too, because I'm self-conscious in our small house and I feel very watched by my parents. I don't want the confrontational aspect of making a loud noise and having rows about it. I just want to be allowed to be on my own and get on with playing without anyone noticing. I become quite secretive about my music and I go to great lengths not to be overheard. When, shortly afterwards, I borrow an amp from someone, I can't bring myself to turn it up very loud. And so the quietness thing begins, born of necessity and ignorance and embarrassment. Only later will it become a kind of manifesto. So after that, I do actually manage to join a band as the token girl on guitar, but I'm not the singer. And one day the boys asked me whether or not I'd like to be. What about you, Trace? Can you sing? They asked. Could I sing? I had no idea. It had never occurred to me. I'd sung a bit at school in the choir, but it was hardly an Aretha-style gospel training. It was more that we got together at lunchtime in the music room and sang Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Since I'd got into punk, I'd spent a lot of time singing along with records at home, but that didn't mean I knew what I sounded like. The singer I most wanted to sound like was Patti Smith, whose Horses album I'd played endlessly. But it was already clear to me that her style of singing required a level of confidence and assertiveness that I was pretty sure was beyond me. In fact, I was worried that any kind of singing ultimately demanded self-confidence more than anything else. Playing rhythm guitar in a band was one thing. It was quite easy to hide behind your guitar and behind what the other guitarist was playing. But being the singer put you fair and square in the middle of the stage. Not that there were any stages yet, and at the front of the whole band. I wasn't a natural show-off, so was that really where I wanted to be? At the same time, I was intrigued by the idea and flattered to be asked. Too embarrassed even to try, as long as everyone was looking at me, I made what was probably a fairly unique request. I'll have a go, but I can't do it if you're all looking at me. Can I go inside the wardrobe and sing from there? The others looked at me strangely, possibly beginning to worry about the apparent absence of any stage personality in this girl they had just recruited. But to their credit, they agreed, without killing themselves laughing, and so in I went. From inside my hidey hole, I sang David Bowie's Rebel Rebel. I emerged to a very positive response, the others all declaring that I sounded like Susie Sue. I was trying very hard to. And while I was quite pleased with myself, I wasn't sure that I would be able to do it in front of an audience, and we could hardly take the wardrobe around with us. Anyway, the strain of trying to sing like Susie had already given me a sore throat, so the very moment that opened my eyes to the possibility of being a singer was tinged with the disappointment of acknowledging that I would never be a Susie or a Patti Smith. And at that time, I wasn't really sure what other type of girl singers there were. The boys were disappointed, and I came away from the rehearsal wondering if I'd let them down. The thought worried away at me during the bus ride home. Why didn't I want it more? Or, not that exactly, for in many ways I really did want it desperately. But why was I so ambivalent about the very concept of attention, both wanting and not wanting it? Making music is never just about making music. It's about being heard, fighting for your personal vision, your own version of events, to be listened to, given weight. It's about making people sit up and notice you and acknowledge your worth. But while I wanted all this, I seemed to want it in an invisible kind of way. I wanted to be heard without having to be heard, or perhaps more specifically, without having to be looked at.
So that section of the book is the perfect way to. Thank you. Yeah, as you please. It's the kind of the perfect way to illustrate one of the central tensions in your book. This thing between wanting to be a pop star. It's the tagline of the book, and this feeling that the public gaze, or in fact at that point in your life, any gaze is what you describe as kryptonite. So how do you begin to reconcile those two things? Is it just a case of kind of meandering through and stumbling into situations and then just stepping up to them? And actually, do you ever feel like you do reconcile those two things?
I don't think I ever completely did. I think there was a mixture of just habit. You know, as we got into doing it more and more, I think there were aspects of it that just became something I got used to doing, and I steeled myself to it. And when we were on tour a lot and doing it night after night, I think I just got into the habit of being ever so slightly on guard all the time, thinking I've got to go on stage later, you know, I've got to be prepared for this. But I don't think I ever really reached a point of just feeling I completely integrated me, the person I was off stage, with someone I had to be on stage, and that's awkward.
There's a kind of, I mean, there's loads and loads of lovely moments in the book, but one that comes to mind when you talk about that is the fact that you'd sort of discovered that you needed hot water, tea and honey on stage with you, and you described the fact that the thermos ended up making your gig something a bit like a picnic in a lay-by. And someone even kind of made you a flight case to carry around on tour with a sort of thermos shape cut out of the foam inside, but you were so embarrassed about it that you took the foam out and used it as a makeup case instead. It's funny because, again, embarrassment is another thing that comes up quite frequently in the book, and you always think of embarrassment as something that makes you contract rather than makes you expand. Is it, you know, is embarrassment a motivating force in any way, or is it just something you have to get over? I'm
not sure it is. I don't think there's any sense in which it's really a good thing to be embarrassed about being a performer if you're trying to be one. That's not to say that being the kind of person who's easily embarrassed isn't a good thing, because that essentially means you're probably quite sensitive and a thinker, which might mean you write good songs. So that's good. But then when you have to get up in front of people and perform those songs, I don't think there's any real argument for being embarrassed about it. But how you deal with that is an unanswerable question.
There's another moment in the book which I thought was really telling about around 1985, and you decide to go and see a vocal coach. I can't remember why. And this vocal coach tries to make you sing properly. And you realise that really what she's telling you is that you're doing it wrong. And so you stop going to see her and devise a new vocal warm-up for yourself before gigs where you just sing along to the Pretenders for half an hour. Is there something about you accepting imperfection, or even more importantly, being yourself? And was that something that you found quite easy to do, actually?
Well, pop singing is essentially wrong. And the thing that, when you go and see vocal teachers, especially then, I do think they've probably got a bit more up to date now. But back then there was still a sense that if you went to see a vocal coach, you were seeing someone who was going to teach you all the rules that had come from classical singing. And all those rules are based on the fact that what you do as a pop singer is just wrong. You're going to damage your voice, you're constricting it, you're doing everything wrong, you're not breathing from here. And, you know, pop singers don't sing like that, because pop singing is about style and personality. So I found it really difficult, because she gave me all these exercises to do that were basically me, you know, about to go on to do a pop gig, and you're backstage in the dressing room going, la 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 la, and it's not right, is it? It's not going to make you go out and sing your song. So I sort of turned my back on that after a while and thought, well, if you're going to be a pop singer, the only way to do it is to sing within that style, and just there's still some argument for warming up, so just sing along with good singers like Chrissie Hynde. So that was my tip. Sing with Chrissie Hynde.
And I guess it's going to make you feel good in a number of ways.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to a sort of specific point in time in 1981 when you had started Marine Girls, and you're there one evening, and you've got your self band, and you've got a drum machine, and you've got a recorder. And you just, not a recorder,
tape recorder.
A tape recorder. No tambourines. And you just record what became your first album. Can you kind of paint us a bit of a picture about what happened that evening?
I don't think I can remember it in any more detail than you've just described. I mean, I do say in the book that anyone who knows me now would find it quite hilarious that having been handed a 4-track tape recorder, I actually worked out how to use it. And in fact, that probably does mark the high point of my technical abilities in terms of recording. I never made it any further than that. But again, I think at that stage we were like children who were just given things to play with, and not knowing that there was any reason to be scared of them. We just kind of went, where does this plug in? Turn it on, go, you know, and just got on with it and did it without apparently any sort of inhibitions that it might not be good enough. I think we just felt if we wanted it enough, then that was reason to do it. And we did it all very quickly. We recorded everything in sort of 1 or 2 takes, and again, we didn't correct many of our mistakes because we just genuinely didn't really know how to. And when I listen back to the early stuff now, I'm kind of shocked at how amateurish it is. But it wasn't willfully amateurish. We really were genuinely doing our best. And I sometimes thought after a while that people slightly fetishised the whole sort of ramshackle indie thing, to the point where you were seen as selling out if you improved from that, which I thought was rubbish. I thought inevitably if you carried on doing it for a bit longer, you were going to get better, and you should get better, really. I mean, right from the beginning, as I say, we were doing our best. We weren't trying to be a bit rubbish. That was just how it came out.
But you know, you were very young, and there's a bit in the book in Dave Haslam's diary where you talk about, it's his diary entry, and you talk about going up to see him, I guess, in Manchester, and someone in the band says, "Oh, I want to go and see the Bullring. I've been learning about that in school."
Yes. Well, Alice was still at school at that point, and as I say, she was, you know, still doing her geography O-levels or something. And I mean, that is a very good example that shows how, in retrospect, here we were, the Marine Girls, you know, we've been written about by Kurt Cobain, so the implication is that we were kind of cool girls and knew that what we were doing was important and influential, but we had not a clue. And really, it's very easy, I think, with a lot of bands to mythologise them after the event. And I suppose one of the things I was trying to do in writing this is just to describe what it actually really felt like from the inside. And whilst I can see how the Marine Girls were quite an unusual band, I'm just trying to point out that at the time we were really just schoolgirls mucking about.
You say in the book that writing this was a bit like drowning, and you spent lots and lots of time with your life flashing kind of in front of your eyes almost. Because I know you started writing it at sort of 2006, almost as a way of getting back into making music. Is there anything, I mean, I know you can't write a book like this without coming away with some reflections or sort of new insights into what happened in your life, but is there anything particular that you recognised or know from having gone through this process of looking back at everything in such a lot of detail?
That when I started writing it all down, first of all, I literally just wrote down everything that happened in a kind of long list. It just went like this, you know, this happened and this happened. And that's the point at which I put it away, thinking it's not really a book, it's just a list of events. And when I came back to read it 3 or 4 years later and realised I could finish it, at that point I reread it and could see that there was a kind of through line, and the whole through line was what we started talking about, the whole sort of concept of ambivalence, of wanting it and not wanting it, you know, feeling like you had a need to be up here and yet finding that very difficult. And that really runs through from the beginning, and it doesn't really go away. And it's a kind of bubbling undercurrent to lots of the stories. So there are lots of different anecdotes, which I think are what make it fun to read, because there's a cast of characters who are good. But there's a sort of thread that runs through it all, and that's what then made me realise there was an angle that could actually make it a book and not just
a diary.
As well as kind of wanting it and not wanting it, something else that comes through really strongly is this idea of bringing together things which other people might not bring together, or which appear not to belong together, in the way that I think you talk about you seeing some of the sort of purity and power of punk in the jazz trio, and whereas other people would have thought that you embracing jazz was not punk somehow. Do you think, is that just something that came, I mean obviously we're sort of moving on here in terms of the sort of different bands you were in, but is that something that you think is to do with you, or is that to do with the kind of partnership, the musical partnership between yourself and Benoit?
I think it's to do with the fact that both Ben and I have a kind of instinctive feeling that the cliches of rock and roll and popular culture in general in some ways that are thought to be avant-garde and rebellious are often not, simply because they're cliches, and that you had to reject them. You know, you couldn't just do rock and roll and follow this path, and that would be forging ahead, because, you know, by the very fact of adopting a cliche, you're just being boring. You're not going anywhere. So we did have this thing in common, I think, that we just thought, well, obviously we can't do any of that. I mean, I do appreciate that other people have managed to adopt rock and roll cliches and make valid records out of them, but I just felt that we couldn't. So we set ourselves all these rules, which we never completely moved away from, which was just that, you know, if you yoked together ideas from different places, and if you did unusual cover versions, and if you did, you know, a jazz song next to an Echo and the Bunnymen song, you'd be, in the very act of doing that, you were kind of exploding cliche, because you're not doing cliched things, and that would be noticed and remarked upon. And it was, by the people who got it. But I do think the danger of it is that it's a bit subtle. And for people who didn't get it, and this went on, I think, through a lot of our career, you know, it was quite hard to explain to them, well, why do you think doing a jazz song is kind of inherently revolutionary? There's a sort of theoretical basis, I think, to some of the stuff we were doing that maybe a lot of the time we understood what we meant, but not everyone else did.
I think you sum it up quite nicely, because there's a bit where you say, you know, coming along like Astrid Gilberto and sounding like Astrid Gilberto and coming on like Gang of Four was always going to be a problem.
Yeah, well, that was true, especially at the beginning when we did interviews where we were really quite spiky, and we were very political as well, as were a lot of people at the times, but, you know, we weren't making records that obviously sounded like you would expect people to sound who had those opinions. So, as I was saying again, there was juxtaposition of things that didn't necessarily go together, but we thought that was being more radical. You know, we thought, again, the sort of unlikely collision of things was, again, uncliched, and that people would spot that was more radical. So
and did you...
It was a risk.
But did you overtly use clothes and the way you looked to kind of emphasise the difference between how you sounded and how you looked?
Yeah, sometimes, especially at the beginning. I mean, I think I do talk about the whole thing of chopping my hair off. I had, around the time when Distant Shore came out, I had sort of this big curly hair thing, which actually I had done to look like Leslie Woods out of the Au Pairs. So that was my point. I was trying to look like Leslie Woods. But in a lot of the photos, I ended up looking a bit kind of... and I looked at them and just thought, oh, God, so I chopped all my hair off. Again, because, you know, having made quite a soft-sounding, heartfelt, emotional record, I thought, well, if you then look like that in all your pictures, you know, it all fits. So it would be more interesting if it doesn't fit.
So can you kind of, again, like, tell us what that look might have looked like, apart from your hair? What were you wearing to sort of signal the difference between the softness and the quietness of the sound and the kind of directness and radicalness that was underneath it?
Well, for a while we were doing, you know, apparently new jazz gigs, I had sort of shaved hair and was wearing a Sex Pistols t-shirt and great big boots and chains around my neck. So it kind of confused people. And then we were being produced, you know, by Robin Miller, who was also producing Sade. And Sade, who, you know, in some respects we weren't musically a million miles away from, but presentationally everything they did fitted and worked, which, as I say, was why that year they were winning the Brit Award for Best Album of the Year, and we were watching it at home on a rented telly. You
kind of mentioned in passing then about being political. And I think one of the things that the book evokes really strongly is a period of time when it was very normal to be political, and there were a whole generation of people who quite naturally had quite strong political views, even to the point where you talk about doing a Q&A in Smash Hits, and they ask you what the book is you've read most recently. It's something like, The Case for the British Withdrawal from Northern Ireland. But that wasn't particularly abnormal in Smash Hits at the time, was it?
I think it probably was. I think I was probably being mischievous.
But on that kind of tip, can you tell us the story about the Socialist Eurovision Song Contest that you were invited to be part of?
Yeah, it was. I still, even in the book, I say I can't quite remember how it happened. But there was an idea that they suddenly thought Labour, who, let's face it, were at this point apparently unelectable, not just out of power but unelectable. That was the kind of argument that went. So that someone came up with the great idea that what we needed was a song for Labour, that we'd choose a song that would be the theme. I guess it would be Things Can Only Get Better, but no one had written Things Can Only Get Better. So we're some like-minded red wedge type people and us, along with some Labour Party people, including Eric Heffer, who was, as I say, old Labour personified. And it's quite hard to remember now, especially anyone who's young enough to perhaps only really know New Labour, to remember what old Labour really were like. So there was this big meeting where we sat and listened to entries of people who'd written their songs that might be a song for Labour. One of which was a sort of typically, apocalyptic reggae track that went by, and Eric Heffer said, well, we don't want any of this country and western nonsense. I don't think he was joking, I really don't. It was serious. It ended badly. The whole meeting ended badly with him saying, we want to hear all the entries from Liverpool, because that's where the only good pop music's ever come from. And I said, and we want to hear all the entries from women. So it was a bit of a standoff.
I believe you actually did listen to all the entries from Liverpool and all the entries from women.
I'm not sure we did. I think it was crumbling at that point. And I don't think we did choose a song for Labour. And we probably doomed Labour to being unelectable for a few more years.
So when kind of time changed and it became sort of less normal for people to be political, you talk in the book about it feeling almost anachronistic. And I guess this was a period, and that there are these periods in the book where you talk about kind of being out of time and sort of having a place in a musical universe and then losing your place in the musical universe. I guess there's a point in the book where you kind of, after all the success of Idlewild, and particularly, I don't want to talk about it, there's a story you tell about going to a Galaxy 500 gig, and you walk in and some kind of people turn around and say, oh, I don't want to talk about it, and someone else says, I don't want to hear about it, in this kind of horrible snidey way. Yeah. And that you say to yourselves, have we become the kind of people that shouldn't be at a Galaxy 500 gig? Yeah. What does it feel like as an artist to lose your place in a musical universe?
Well, it's very uncomfortable, and that was the whole sort of complicated thing about being part of the indie world and then suddenly not being part of it. And there's no really easy way to resolve that. The indie world and the scene that we came from can be quite puritanical, and it can be quite judgmental, and woe betide you if you have the wrong kind of hit. And I think the danger was with I Don't Want to Talk About It, which I still argue is a very good record and a great song, but in some respects was regarded as the wrong type of hit and took us out of that world. And it's quite hard to be allowed back in. And you may feel that, I think we felt that not very much had really changed about what we were doing. We'd always done covers for a start. Our first single was a cover. People, it had apparently been okay to do a Cole Porter cover. But then a few years later, doing a Danny Whitten cover is, I don't know, regarded as too commercial. But, it's partly just the times moving on. By that stage, we'd been around a bit longer. We didn't have that power of newness when you can almost do anything in your first year or two and it seems new and radical. But that was the point at which I think we began to realise that, we'd sort of taken a step out of a world we'd been comfortable in and sort of looked around and thought, well, we need to find a new world, and the world we stepped into didn't feel like it fitted for a few years. And that was, what I describe in the book as being what I think is the low point of our career, not because every record we made was rubbish, but just because we didn't feel like we belonged, and so it wasn't as much fun, even though I can listen back and think, well, that's quite a good song, and I can see why we did that, but it just felt a little bit rootless and like we were sort of drifting a bit on our own.
But it's funny actually, because the rootlessness took you to America, which actually laid the seeds for all the stuff that happened afterwards, because you ended up in America as being seen, and you're very honest about this, you ended up being seen in the same way as people like Sade and the sort of R&B production outfit, Jam and Lewis, but also kind of Enya and Kenny G. But and again, you're very honest about all those things throughout the book. But so you end up in America, and then it's the sort of period of time you spend there that leads on to other things. I'm repeating myself now. So what was it for you about that time there that you could tell us about?
Well, the Going to America period when we made Language of Life album was really us thinking, well, perhaps in a way we've exhausted the sort of indie ideal, the DIY thing that we started from. You know, we really had done it, and perhaps we'd wrung it dry, and perhaps after all there is something in this idea of a proper old school producer, and you know, they make some good records out there in America, let's be honest. And I think we just thought, look, let's bloody go for it. Let's just, instead of doing this thing of needing complete control over every aspect of it and being quite puritanical about it all, you know, let's just open ourselves up to it, get a producer in and some musicians and see what they can make of it. So, you know, it was a concept. There was a sort of deliberate decision involved in doing that, which has its drawbacks. You know, again, I think the danger is that it just turned us into what they would call the talent. You know, you're just the kind of bit on the top of the record, and a lot of the sort of production ideas were all being taken by other people. And we wrote the songs and then sort of came in and I sang them and Ben played, you know, guitar and piano. But what we'd always done before that was sort of had our hands on every single aspect of the decision making, and that was the record on which we didn't do that. And it was just quite a strange thing, I think.
Feeling like guesting on your own record?
Yes, a bit. I don't regret doing it. You know, there was part of me that thought, well, I want to feel, what's it feel like to, you know, work the way Dusty Springfield would have worked, for instance. You know, she used to put together a band, and, you know, Dusty in Memphis was made like that, for God's sake. Best record ever made. So, you know, there must be something in it. So we kind of, you know, had a go.
I guess this is a phase where ambition was more at the front, the kind of wanting it, maybe, rather than the sort of stepping back.
Yes, I mean, I do try to be honest in the book about things like ambition, because again, I do think we've always been regarded as the sort of group who, because we haven't had hit after hit after hit, and because we've had principles, obviously, that therefore we haven't been ambitious, and that's not true. There have been periods when we've, as I say, even talking about the Marine Girls, you know, when we have actually been trying quite hard, and it just hasn't always worked. You know, the ambition's sometimes been tempered by the principles, so that's undermined things perhaps, and maybe the seeds of, you know, it not being as successful as it could have been lay within those principles. But I do try to be honest about the fact that, you know, we did have moments of thinking it would be nice to just have a hit record. That's supposed to be what you're supposed to be trying to do.
But like you say, actually, the kind of honesty about ambition, you say at one point in it that you think, you know, even though everybody pretended they didn't care what anyone else was doing, you think that you and all of your peers could have quite accurately said exactly where everyone was in the charts, and probably accurately said how many records everybody else had sold.
Well, I certainly own up to the fact that we did. I mean, I can't argue as to whether everyone else did, but I do own up to the fact that, yeah, we did.
No, we've probably got about another 10 minutes or so before we, maybe a tiny bit longer, before we ask you guys to ask some questions. So do have a think about what you might want to ask. So if we're moving forward to what you might call the sort of second phase of Everything But the Girl, you know, people know about Massive Attack and about the kind of drum and bass stuff that happened, but there were another band that were important in this second phase that isn't quite as obvious. Can you tell us how Fairport Convention fitted into this phase of things?
Yeah, Fairport Convention, our sound engineer, I mean, we're at the point now where, you know, the career's had a bit of a nosedive, Ben's been ill in hospital, that's the sort of crisis point, and after that we sort of dragged ourselves back into doing some work and started doing acoustic gigs where we just go out as a duo, And it was good, actually. We really enjoyed that period. We were doing these tiny little gigs again, and it felt to us a bit like we'd gone right back to our roots and back to the early days when, even though we were playing as an acoustic duo, it was all quite fired up and lively. So we were enjoying ourselves. And we had a sound engineer who worked with Fairport Convention. And it was his idea, I think, that we got together with them, and for their annual Cropredy festival that they do, that we'd go out and rehearse with them and sing the iconic Sandy Denny's Who Knows Where the Time Goes, which they end the festival with, and perhaps do a couple of other songs. So we went out to this little village where Fairport Convention all seemed to live, and they really did all just seem to live in this little village, like Stella Street. There'd be the bass player there, and next to the baker was the drummer. And it was all pints of beer, obviously, because they're folkies.
And jumpers.
And jumpers, there were jumpers. But they didn't seem to have a manager or a record company or any of the kind of infrastructure. They did just seem to do it themselves. And again, a little light bulb went on in our heads of just thinking, you can still do this. You don't have to be new. You don't have to be on your first record. You can actually be a band who've been around as long as Fairport Convention and still hold true to the DIY ethic, and it can still put you in touch with an audience who might get what you do. So meeting up with them kind of chimed with how we were feeling, which was quite reinvigorated and quite DIY. And I think at that particular moment we pictured that perhaps something similar could work for us, and we could start running our own career, doing acoustic gigs. It would all be lovely, very cottagey, and then we recorded Missing. I went a bit somewhere else.
But the other thing that happened, and we'll come back to Missing, is that the day after the Fairport Convention gig, Massive Attack called you.
Yes, at almost exactly the same time as working with Fairport, and so being all kind of in the folk mindset and thinking this was great. Massive Attack got in touch and asked if I'd sing on what was going to be their second album, and sent a cassette. This was the days when people still sent you a cassette. And we put it on in the car, and it just went for about 5 minutes. Seriously, that was all it did. And we kind of looked at each other going, okay. And then I kept playing it over the next few days, and eventually I wrote Protection over it. But there wasn't any sense of, where it might begin or end, or was there a verse, was there a chorus, who knew? So I just wrote a song that kind of started at a random point. It actually started at a point that they thought turned out halfway through the bar. How they knew where the bar was, God knows. They said, you started halfway through the bar. Okay. But apparently it was okay. So that happened at exactly the same time. And, so it seemed in a way like, this bizarre thing where 2 or 3 things happened sort of at the same time, that just all seemed to, it shouldn't have fitted. Again, it's a slightly bizarre mixture of things, that you're working with Fairport and Massive. But to us, it made sense. And we were doing the Amplified Heart album, which on that record we were trying to sort of yoke together the acoustic-y Fairport influence with beats, and that was the sort of whole concept for that record. And Missing, the original version, was supposed to be exactly that, really, a sort of songy track that we actually wrote over the loop of Raises Break for Love, thinking, well, this will be good because we can have some great mixes done.
And that's exactly what happened.
That was exactly
what happened. Because there's a story where you're in New York, and the record's kind of developed a life of its own in the clubs, and this makes sense to the clubs, the people in New York clubs, because you're seen in this kind of certain way in America, and then you're there with Massive Attack, and you're in a taxi, and I don't know whether it's like Daddy G or whoever it is in Massive Attack, tries to explain to you that your record's being played in the club, like you don't know what clubs are.
Yeah, no, they
and like you definitely don't know what.
They thought I was Mary Hopkin, basically, which was fine, but. They said to me, someone's done a remix of your track. I know, Todd Terry. I know, we know who Todd Terry is. We got it done. Oh, they went, okay. But that was like the first inkling. Bear in mind, this is now about 8 months after the album and the track's been out. We've already had some remixes done that have done okay and kind of been and gone. And the Todd Terry remix had been delivered to everyone at the record company, who'd all gone, yeah, that's really nice. That was it. No one went, that's a surefire massive hit, that is. They went, that's really nice. So it didn't.
There was one guy,
everyone.
Wasn't there? One guy in the A&R department
who
absolutely
Johnny
loved
D
it and really pushed it
in America. He did think that it deserved, to be pushed, and also he could see that it was taking off in American clubs. It took off in Miami first, and he kind of fanned the little flames they were building, and it was, yes, it is definitely to his credit, if to anyone's, that there was some effort put behind it, but ultimately it was one of those tracks that sort of just broke all the rules and just did it by itself. It was out there in clubs, and people just decided for themselves that they liked it, without anyone showing them a video or playing it to them on the radio. They just heard it on the dance floor and decided they liked it. And that's, although it was a remix, and people say to me, oh, was it frustrating that you had a hit with a remix? But I never felt that. I felt in the end that we had a hit with a song we'd written, and nothing of the song was taken away. Todd Terry always says all he did was, make it dance a little bit. He kept the song intact. And I always felt that what happened was the song sort of went out there on its own, and people sort of adopted it. So it was the nicest kind of hit, really.
But I guess people adopted it, but it also had some momentum, or created a different kind of momentum for you two as well, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I mean, at the end of that, when it had sold 3 million copies or something, we were somewhere very different to where we'd been at the beginning of that year, and all the little theories about being Fairport Convention suddenly didn't seem to make so much sense. And instead, the album we made after that, which was Walking Wounded, was, basically our biggest, most commercial pop record, essentially. Right at the point when we'd sort of thought, oh, thank God, we don't have to try making pop records anymore. But then suddenly, when it seemed like we could make one that might work, it seemed appealing. I think what hadn't appealed was the idea of sort of banging our heads against a wall, of feeling that we were trying to do something that didn't completely come from our hearts and wasn't going to work. But when we were offered the opportunity to make a record that came from the heart and it was going to work, then that was very appealing.
But the funny thing is, even when you're in a sort of blessed situation, like you describe, of all those things being right, you still have to do things you don't really like doing. In your case, like festivals, which you describe as something like, I hate festivals, they are everything I've always wanted to destroy. It's quite a strong thing to say about a festival.
Well, I'm not the festival generation, I don't think. I mean, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but we thought it was just hippies in fields, wasn't it? I mean, didn't we hate festivals, and then suddenly they were back in, and you had to go and play Glastonbury. I never got it. To me, music is at its best in a little club, preferably downstairs, someone else's cigarette smoke in your face. That's a gig. I don't want to be in a field. I like being in fields, but I don't want anyone else to be in the field, and I don't want a band to be over there while I'm in a field.
But while we're talking about fields, it is cold and wet.
And it's going to be raining, isn't
and
it?
It will be raining.
It's going to be raining. So.
But can you tell us about the kind of, again, the curious incident of things coming together that shouldn't come together, of when Ben ended up on stage with Jeff Buckley at a festival?
Yes. Well, so we agreed to do Glastonbury because we had to, and we were doing it as a duo, but I won't go into the long story of how Ben had met Jeff Buckley at the hairdressers, but he had. So just take for granted that Ben's met Jeff Buckley at the hairdressers. And they'd said, while they were at the hairdressers, we should do a gig together, because you do. So we're about to go on stage at Glastonbury, and Jeff Buckley, who's also playing later that day, suddenly wanders into our little hut dressing room, at which point I faint, obviously. And he says, yeah, we were going to do a song together. And I went, well, yeah, but we're going on now, so it's too late, obviously. He goes, no, it's not. Let's work something out. So he grabs a guitar. I'm going, we're going on, we're going on now. And he says, no, let's do a Smiths song. So we work out in about 30 seconds that we both know how to sing I Know It's Over by the Smiths. And that's it. So Ben and I go out and do 20 minutes of our set, and then, like Paul Weller coming on at the ICA, Jeff Buckley suddenly comes on, and we kind of stumble, slightly drunkenly, I must admit, because the other thing I haven't said is that I was actually a bit pissed. But we can pass over that. we stumble through a Smith song, and then later that day Jeff's doing his own set, and we're sort of in the wings watching Jeff. He's the hero of that year, let's remember, I don't know when it is, 96 or something, and he beckons Ben on stage, like the bit at the end of Spinal Tap, you know, they do the reunion, beckoning Ben on stage. Come on. So Ben goes on with a guitar, and Jeff goes, kick out the jams, 1, 2, 3, 4. So Ben, bless him, does manage to actually join in, and in a true spirit of destroying rock and roll, I'm not sure, plays Kick Out the Jams with Jeff Buckley. See, that's festivals for you. That's what they're like, isn't it?
It certainly is. Well, I've got one more thing to ask you before we kind of get you guys to see what you want to ask, and it's just a kind of tiny thing really about the sort of way that from this period we're talking about, you ended up as kind of part of drum and bass, or as sort of, certainly part of that. And there's a bit where you talk about going to a club called Speed, which was one of the clubs where sort of drum and bass was developed, on a tiny club, like the kind of place you're saying music should happen. And a really nice thing that you say about it is how it reminded you of a sort of postmodern specials gig, and this idea that something felt possible. And for me as a reader, it was a really nice way of bringing together all that stuff that had happened, because really the kind of context doesn't really matter, the sort of detail of the context, but that feeling was the same.
Yes.
So how, when I know I've just kind of said what you felt about it.
You've told the whole story, haven't you? Killed it.
But what was it about that world that appealed to you and made it possible for you guys to kind of be part of it?
Well, musically, it was Ben's area, really. I must be honest and admit that, you know, he was the one who immediately saw the musical possibilities much sooner than I did. And he was just fascinated by the whole sort of polyrhythmic thing going on. And also he could see that on these records, there's just tons of space, that you've got lots of stuff going on right down here, and then you've got a whacking great hole, which you could stick my voice in, because it's good if there's a big hole. So he could hear how it would work. But then he said, he started going down to Speed, and he said to me, come down. And I was a bit sceptical, thinking, well, come on, how's this going to work? I think it was just before Missing had been a hit, so we weren't sort of being stared at for Missing, but the Massive Attack stuff had come out. So all people knew of me really was that I was the singer with Massive Attack. So that was okay, because you could go to a club like Speed and everyone would look at you and go, that's the singer with Massive Attack. So that was kind of my badge to get in. But what was nice about it was that it wasn't a showy kind of scene at all. It was a lot of blokes, not so many girls, if we're honest. But it wasn't aggressive, you know, it was a really nice kind of slightly muso-y kind of scene, really. It's a lot of leaning on the DJ booth, you know, looking over. Oh, I've got that one.
That's the only reason ever to know a record, surely.
Yeah. But people properly danced, and danced sort of quite unself-consciously and quite unshow-offily, and no one was dressed up, everyone was very dressed down. So again, as I say, that's what reminded me of, you know, the whole sort of thing about being a little bit like being a specials gig, and everyone was doing this slightly ska dancing, you know, and it was good. And again, we were at that stage of our life where I think, you know, we'd been through quite an extreme experience with Ben's illness, and we were a little bit like, you know, people who'd just been given a fresh start and just enjoying everything.
Absolutely. I think it's time for some questions from you folk.
It's question time.
It's question time.
You be Dimbleby.
Oh no, yeah. I couldn't be Dimbleby. I haven't got any glasses on. I just wouldn't be able to do that. Okay.
You've got to point at someone and say, the lady over there, and he goes, I'm a man! That's how it works on question time.
Or like I did at a festival recently where there were loads of people in striped deck chairs, and I said, oh yeah, the person over there in the striped deck chair. That wasn't really very useful. Is there anyone who has a question they'd like to ask? We might need some lights to be able to see who's going to ask. Yeah, over there.
Nice and near.
I've been following you for a number of years, and I think your voice is just fabulous, and I'm sure most people here how do you feel about lesser talented female vocalists? I'm thinking more of the Cheryl Coles of the world. How do you feel about them?
I'm not going to sit up here and diss Cheryl
So I'm not
Cole.
sure. I'm not sure everyone heard the question.
You've got the wrong person.
I don't mean to diss Cheryl Cole, but what I'm saying is there's an awful lot of female vocalists that are not as talented as you, that have these massive, massive careers. How do you feel about that? Because
Oh, I wouldn't. Oh, you can't. Don't be silly. I wouldn't give it a minute's thought. I think, I don't know, it's horses for courses. There's a lot of people out there who have got all sorts of different talents. Cheryl Cole has got talents I haven't got, and there are qualities to being a proper pop star, which is why I say how I tried to be a pop star, because I don't think I have the ability to really be a pop star. And, there are certain qualities you need for that, which I take my hat off to in people who've got them. You don't need everyone to be a singer. There's room out there for pop records which have got vocals on them, and I think that's different and not necessarily bad.
Any other questions?
Hi Tracey. What have you got in the pipeline music-wise for you in the future? Anything fun?
So what's next?
What's next? Not at the moment. I mean, having done the Christmas record, which was quite recent, I'm a bit at that stage of thinking, oh, what do I do next? So, and then now I'm busy doing the book stuff. So the honest answer is I don't know, but there will be. It's not. I haven't. Now I'm back to doing it, and since I got back to doing solo records again, I love it again, and I kind of think I've found a way of doing it at the level I want to do it at. And I do end the book by saying, I talk about meeting Lady Sovereign and feeling like her mum, but actually quite liking that feeling. And that's very true. I do actually feel like I've reached a point where I'm probably happier in my own skin than I ever was when I was younger and more successful. So I've kind of struck a balance now, so I don't see any reason to stop. I won't ever stop now.
Good.
So it's going to cost me more money then, yeah?
Yeah, fundamentally.
I think there was another question over here somewhere. Who kind of... Oh, okay, then question at the back.
I can't see. Hello.
You made a wonderful record a long time ago with Robert Wyatt, the Ben Seremos.
Oh, yeah.
Thing. And I was wondering, what would it take to get Robert Wyatt to be on one of your records again?
I don't know, we'd have to ask him. Robert Wyatt is wonderful. Yes. And it was an absolute honour to be on a record. And so did Ben. Ben made a wonderful EP called Summer into Winter, which had Robert Wyatt playing piano and singing on. So we've both been lucky enough to work with Robert Wyatt. Yes. What an honour. That's all I can say, really.
Again would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Any more? Where else do we have some questions? Here at the front.
This is, I suppose, the inevitable question. Do you think you'll ever make another Everything But the Girl?
Oh, I was waiting for that.
I went to one of those acoustic concerts, by the way. I drove to Oxford, so I feel I can ask it.
You're allowed. You've got your
It's not a
stripes.
forbidden question. I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. People do ask it, obviously, and, obviously we haven't split up because we haven't split up.
I know from Twitter.
So, yeah. There's lots of different reasons, really. There's musical reasons which would revolve around us having to have an idea that made us think we could do something a bit new, because we're neither of us particularly nostalgic people. The records probably suggest otherwise, but we're not, on the old 80s revival tours thinking, wouldn't it be lovely to just go out there and sing each and every one every night? So I think we'd have to have a new idea. The other thing is, and that people do slightly underestimate, is being in a band with your husband is not the easiest thing in the world. And we did it for an awful lot of years and made it work quite well. And that was a very good thing, and I'm proud of it. But I don't want to push my luck.
See, that's the other thing. How do you write an autobiography when the other person in your band is your husband,
Yes.
and when you've always been very good at, or very specific about how you've managed that in terms of the way you talk about it to the world?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, I do say at the end of the book, I do thank Ben for letting me tell a story that's half his, as though it were all mine. Because I have written this book, and people are sort of talking about it a lot of the time, as though it's me telling my story. And I've had to angle it like that, because you can't have a book that's we did this, we did that, yeah. So I've kind of personalised some of it to make it seem more like a story from one person. But yes, it's very true that a lot of this is stuff that happened to both of us, and where decisions involved were taken by both of us. So I do try and acknowledge that.
And he's got another book. I saw him saying
Yes.
he's writing another book at the moment about something to do with his family.
Yes, Ben's written a fantastic book. I'll plug Ben's book now. About his parents, and it's coming out next February and published by Bloomsbury, and it is brilliant.
And do you think there's another, I mean obviously music is another thing, and I imagine the music will always come when it's going to come, and you know, the songs come when they come. But is there another book in the future for you, do you think?
I'd like to. I mean, I enjoyed writing this, and I think, you know, it requires different skills to writing songs, and the writing of non-fiction appeals to the sort of student in me, you know, the one who did the English degree and likes making notes and organising material. So writing this book was almost the first opportunity I've ever had really to use those skills, and I'd quite like to do it again. So I just need another topic. I haven't got a novel in me, I'm not a novelist.
It's funny actually, because I was talking to my friend about you and about the book, and she was saying she thought maybe you were actually more of a writer than a singer. You happened to be a writer who could sing, and that writing is a very solitary kind of world task, and that maybe that's part of the reason why there was this thing, this tension between wanting to do it and then having to perform it because it was your work, but really at the heart you were really the person who just wanted to be in their room by themselves writing.
Well, that's true up to a point. I mean, if that were completely true, I think it would be a simpler story, but the point is the ambivalence, you know. I do also talk about when I was in the Marine Girls, where I wasn't the singer, that I actually became very jealous of someone else singing my songs. So I am possessive about them. I'm not there are people out there who are songwriters who hand their songs over to other singers, and that's a talent in itself, I think, to just be the songwriter, but I don't think I could do that. I'm a bit possessive about them.
See, writer and singer. I think all that's left to do then is to say, Tracey Thorn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the book signing will be at the back of Rough Trade as well. Thank you.